Miss Marple and the servant who served poison with teeth. Afternoon sun draped itself across the manicured lawns of Blackthorn Manor with the kind of gentle insistence that made even the most industrious of English gardeners pause to admire their handiwork. It was the third Saturday in June, and Mrs. Lavinia Blackthorn had opened her estate for the annual summer garden party, an event that for the past 23 years had marked the unofficial beginning of the village's social season. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a white canvas canopy, her knitting needles clicking with methodical precision as she observed the gathering with the detached interest of someone who had long ago learned that human nature revealed itself most honestly when people believed themselves unobserved. She had positioned herself strategically not at the center of activities where the vicar's wife held court, nor at the periphery where the less socially confident lingered, but rather at that comfortable middle distance where conversations drifted past like autumn leaves, available for collection should anything prove interesting. More cucumber sandwiches, Miss Marple. The voice belonged to Thomas Hartley, the Blackthorn's butler of 15 years, whose posture suggested military training and whose expression suggested he had long ago perfected the art of appearing present while thinking of something entirely different. How thoughtful. Mr. Hartley, Miss Marple replied, selecting a sandwich with her characteristic delicacy. Though I must say, these are particularly well prepared. Mrs. Blackthorn is fortunate to have such capable staff. Hartley's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Mrs. Blackthorn is exacting in her standards, madame. We endeavour to meet them. There was something in the pause before exacting that made Miss Marple filed the comment away in that comprehensive mental archive she maintained of human peculiarities. She had noticed, over the years, that the space between words often contained more truth than the words themselves. The garden party proceeded with the orchestrated casualness that such events demanded. Lady Pemberton, resplendent in a hat that appeared to have been constructed from an entire flower shop, pontificated about her recent trip to Bodden. Colonel Weatherby, retired from the Indian Army and never quite recovered from the shock of England's climate, complained about the dampness despite the cloudless sky. Young Amanda Foster, the doctor's daughter, laughed too loudly at the jokes of Martin Cresswell, a London solicitor who had recently inherited a cottage in the village and who seemed determined to establish himself as a man of leisure and limited means, though Miss Marple had observed his cufflinks and knew them to be Platinum. Mrs. Blackthorn herself, woman of 62, who dressed as though she were 40 and acted as though she were 70, moved through her guests with the proprietorial satisfaction of someone who knew her social position to be unassailable. Her late husband, industrialist Geoffrey Blackthorn, had left her not merely comfortable but monumentally wealthy, a fact she managed to communicate without ever discussing anything so vulgar as money. Jane, how wonderful to see you. Mrs. Blackthorn descended upon Miss Marple with the kind of effusive warmth that suggested their acquaintance was far deeper than it actually was. I was just telling dear Lady Pemberton that we must have you at our little dinner party next week. Intimate, you understand, just 12 of us. I do so value your perspective on things. Miss Marple understood perfectly that her perspective was valued primarily because Mrs. Blackthorn enjoyed collecting what she considered to be quaint examples of village life, much as she collected the porcelain shepherdesses that lined her drawing room. How kind, Miss Marple murmured, knowing she would attend for precisely the same reason she attended most social functions, because people revealed themselves in company, and revelations were, in their own way, deeply educational. The afternoon wore on. Tea was served at 4 o'clock precisely. A magnificent spread presided over by Hartley and assisted by Sarah Jennings, the housemaid whose recent engagement to the greengrocer's son had been the subject of considerable village speculation. The girl moved with nervous efficiency, her hands trembling slightly as she poured from the heavy silver. Teapot a tremor, Miss Marple noted with the clinical interest of someone who had long ago learned to distinguish between ordinary nervousness and the particular agitation that preceded significant events. Sarah seems unsettled, Miss Marple observed quietly to Mrs. Dunstable, the baker's wife, who had seated herself nearby with a plate piled improbably high with cake. Wedding nerves. I expect, Mrs. Dunstable replied through a mouthful of victorious sponge. Though there's been talk, but then there's always talk, isn't there, Miss Marple? Indeed there is, Miss Marple agreed, her needles never pausing. What sort of talk? Mrs. Dunstable leaned in conspiratorially, lowering her voice to that stage whisper that carries further than normal speech. Well, I shouldn't repeat gossip, but they say young Peter, that's the greengrocer's son, they say he's been seen in Milchester with that widow who runs the bookshop. The pretty one, Mrs. Cavendish. Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion erupted near the tea table. Mrs. Blackthorne had been in the midst of raising her teacup to her lips when she suddenly gasped, the cup clattering to the ground. Her face had gone alarmingly pale, and her hands clutched at her throat. Lavinia! Lady Pemberton shrieked, rushing forward with remarkable speed for someone wearing 3-inch heels. Someone fetched Dr. Foster. But Dr. Foster was already moving, his professional instincts overriding his social hesitation. He reached Mrs. Blackthorne just as she collapsed onto the lawn, her expensive silk dress crumpling beneath her. The carefully orchestrated gentility of the garden party dissolved into chaos as guests surged forward, then retreated, then surged forward again in the peculiar dance of people confronted with crisis and unsure of their role in it. Miss Marple did not move from her chair. Instead, her eyes tracked the movements of those around her with the quiet intensity of a naturalist observing specimens. She noted that Hartley had gone rigid, his professional composure fracturing for just a moment before reasserting itself. She observed that Sarah Jennings had gone white as chalk and was backing away from the tea table as though it had suddenly grown teeth. She registered that Martin Cresswell, the solicitor, had produced a mobile phone and was already speaking urgently into it, his earlier affectation of leisurely gentleman entirely abandoned, and she noticed, though perhaps no one else did, that young Amanda Foster, the doctor's daughter, was not looking at Mrs. Blackthorne at all. Instead, her gaze was fixed on Sarah Jennings with an expression that combined fear, fury, and something else. Something that looked remarkably like recognition. I'm afraid she's gone, Dr. Foster announced, his voice tight with professional restraint. We'll need to contact the police immediately. This is not a natural death. The words fell into the shocked silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of horror through the assembled guests. Miss Marple's knitting needles finally paused, suspended in mid-stitch, as she contemplated the scene before her. A garden party in an English village, a wealthy widow, a cup of poisoned tea, and somewhere among the cucumber sandwiches and polite conversation, a murderer who would serve death with the same casual efficiency as one might serve refreshments. How very unfortunate, Miss Marple murmured to herself, setting aside her knitting with careful deliberation. And how very, very deliberate. The peaceful afternoon had ended. The investigation, Miss Marple suspected, was only just beginning by evening. The news of Mrs. Blackthorne's death had spread through the village of St. Mary, Mead with the inexorable efficiency of ivy climbing a wall. The police had arrived within the hour. Inspector Craddock from the county constabulary, a competent man in his 40s whom Miss Marple had encountered on previous occasions and who had learned, somewhat reluctantly, to value her observations. The village had been transformed overnight into a theatre of speculation. At the Blue Boar, where Colonel Weatherby held court each evening over his whiskey, the conversation centered on nothing else. In the post office, where Mrs. Trimble presided over both mail distribution and information dissemination with equal authority, theories multiplied like rabbits. Even the church, where Reverend Clement prepared his sermon for Sunday, found its usual tranquility disrupted by the extraordinary circumstances. Miss Marple had returned to her cottagier, comfortable establishment on the high street that she had occupied for more years than most residents could. Remember, Anne settled herself in her favorite chair by the window. From this vantage point, she could observe the comings and goings of the village while appearing to be merely an elderly lady, enjoying the evening air. Her nephew Raymond, a successful novelist who occasionally visited from London, had once asked her why she spent so much time simply watching. "My dear boy," she had replied, "people are endlessly fascinating. They say one thing and mean another. They believe they are acting logically when they are actually driven by emotion, and they almost always underestimate the importance of small details." Now, as she watched Sarah Jennings hurry past her window with tears streaming down her face, Miss Marple reflected that small details were accumulating at a remarkable rate. The knock on her door came at precisely 7 o'clock. Inspector Craddock stood on her doorstep, his hat in his hands and his expression suggesting that this was not a social call, though the box of biscuits he carried indicated he understood the protocols of English hospitality. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." "Of course, Inspector. Do come in. I've just made tea." They settled in her sitting room, where the inspector balanced his teacup with the careful attention of a man who had been briefed on the afternoon's events and was consequently viewing all beverages with suspicion. "I understand you were present at Blackthorne Manor this afternoon," he began, consulting his notebook with the methodical precision that Miss Marple appreciated in police work. "Indeed I was. A terrible tragedy. Poor Mrs. Blackthorne, though I must confess, Inspector, that it strikes me as a rather extraordinary way to die at one's own garden party. Extraordinary is certainly one word for it." Craddock set down his teacup with a sigh. "The preliminary examination suggests poison, something fast-acting, administered in her tea. We've taken the teapot, the cups, everything from the service into evidence. The problem, Miss Marple, is that approximately 40 people were present, and at least a dozen had access to the tea service before Mrs. Blackthorne was served. But not equal access, surely." Miss Marple's needles had resumed their rhythmic clicking, though her attention remained focused entirely on the inspector. "No, not equal access. The housemaid, Sarah Jennings, poured Mrs. Blackthorne's tea specifically. She's been taken in for questioning, naturally. The girl is in a state of complete hysteria, claiming she had nothing to do with it, that someone must have tampered with the tea before she served it. And do you believe her?" Craddock hesitated, demonstrating the professional caution that made him a competent investigator. "I don't know what to believe yet. On the surface, she's the obvious suspect. she had the best opportunity. And apparently, there had been some friction between her and Mrs. Blackthorne recently. What sort of friction? According to the butler, Hartley, Mrs. Blackthorne had discovered that Sarah had been taking certain liberties, small things, using her ladyship's bath salts, trying on her jewellery when she thought no one was watching. Mrs. Blackthorne had threatened to dismiss her, without a reference. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. That would indeed be serious for a young woman planning to marry. A position without a reference would be difficult to obtain. Precisely. And yet, Craddock trailed off, his expression troubled. And yet, you have reservations. Several, actually. First, the poison used appears to be somewhat sophisticated, not something a housemaid would typically have access to or knowledge of. Second, Sarah Jennings strikes me as genuinely terrified rather than guilty. And third, he consulted his notebook again. There's the matter of the will. This caught Miss Marple's full attention. Mrs. Blackthorne's will. Mrs. Blackthorne had summoned her solicitor, Mr. Creswell, the gentleman who's recently moved to the village to Blackthorne Manor 3 days ago. According to Mr. Creswell, she intended to make substantial changes to her existing will. However, she died before signing the new document. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And what were these changes? That's where it becomes complicated. The current will, signed 5 years ago, leaves the bulk of her estate, approximately £3 million, to her nephew, David Blackthorne, who lives in London. There are smaller bequests to various charities and to Hartley, who receives £20,000 for his years of service. The new will, which she never signed, would have changed everything. In what way? The nephew would have been left merely £50,000, considerable reduction. The bulk of the estate was to be divided between a cousin in Australia whom nobody seems to know much about, and a charitable foundation for animal welfare. Mrs. Blackthorne was apparently quite passionate about animal rights, something her nephew apparently found ridiculous. Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely, a gesture that indicated serious consideration. So the nephew benefits substantially from her death occurring before the new will was signed. Indeed, David Blackthorne inherits £3 million instead of 50,000. Quite a motive, wouldn't you say? Quite substantial, Miss Marple agreed, though I don't recall seeing Mr. David Blackthorne at the garden party. He wasn't there. According to his statement, he was in London all day, attending meetings that have been corroborated by multiple witnesses. His alibi is essentially unbreakable. How convenient. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but Craddock had learned to recognize that particular inflection. You suspect he's involved, despite the alibi. I suspect nothing yet, Inspector. I merely observe that alibis can be truthful and yet misleading. A man can be in London and still be responsible for events in St. Mary Mead, particularly if he has the intelligence to employ intermediaries. Craddock nodded slowly. We're investigating all possibilities. The problem is that we have too many suspects and too little concrete evidence. The housemaid had opportunity and a weak motive. The nephew had a strong motive, but no apparent opportunity. The butler receives a legacy, though £20,000 hardly seems worth murdering one's employer. And then there are the guests, any one of whom might have had access to the tea service during the general confusion. Tell me, Inspector, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. Have you considered the matter of the teacup? The teacup. Mrs. Blackthorne's teacup specifically. I observed that when Sarah Jennings poured the tea, she used the entire service the same teapot, the same milk jug, the same sugar bowl. Other guests had already been served from the same service without incident. Yet only Mrs. Blackthorne was poisoned, which suggests the poison was in her cup, specifically, not in the general tea service. Precisely. Which raises rather interesting questions about timing and access, doesn't it? Craddock leaned forward. What did you observe, Miss Marple? Nothing conclusive yet, Inspector. But I did notice several small things that struck me as inconsistent with the general pattern of behavior. For instance, young Amanda Foster, Dr. Foster's daughter, was watching Sarah Jennings, rather than her own father's patient. Martin Cresswell, the solicitor, seemed unsurprised by the emergency, as though he had been anticipating some sort of disruption. And Hartley, the butler, demonstrated a moment of what I can only describe as relief before his professional composure reasserted itself. Relief. Yes, as though something he had been dreading had finally occurred, and the worst was now over. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with an air of finality. Inspector, I wonder if you might indulge an elderly woman's curiosity. Would it be possible for me to visit Blackthorne Manor tomorrow? I find that houses reveal a great deal about their inhabitants, particularly in the aftermath of significant events. Craddock considered this request. I don't see why not. The scene has been thoroughly processed. Mr. David Blackthorne arrives tomorrow to begin making arrangements. I'm sure he would have no objection to your paying a condolence call. How very kind. And Inspector, you might wish to inquire into the relationship between Amanda Foster and Sarah Jennings. I have a feeling that there's more to that particular connection than meets the eye. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting lying idle in her lap. Through her window, she could see lights coming on throughout the village as evening deepened into night. Somewhere in those houses, among those seemingly ordinary people living seemingly ordinary lives, was someone who had committed murder with remarkable audacity and considerable planning. The question was not merely who, but why, and in Miss Marple's extensive experience, the why often revealed the who in the most unexpected ways. Sunday morning dawned with the kind of determined brightness that seemed at odds with murder. Miss Marple attended the 8 o'clock service at St. Mary's Church, where Reverend Clement delivered a sermon on the sin of bearing false witness that struck her as somewhat tactless given the current circumstances. The congregation was larger than usual. Tragedy, she reflected, brought people together in ways that mere piety could not. After the service, she made her way toward Blackthorne Manor, stopping first at the village shop where Mrs. Trimble held court behind the counter. Such a terrible business. Miss Marple, Mrs. Trimble said, her eyes bright with the excitement that even the most compassionate people experience in the face of scandal. They say poor Sarah Jennings has been released from police custody, but everyone knows she did it. Why else would she have been so nervous before it happened? Nervous people do not necessarily commit murder, Mrs. Trimble, Miss Marple replied mildly. Sometimes they are nervous because they know something is about to happen, not because they have made it happen. This philosophical distinction was lost on Mrs. Trimble, who continued to enumerate Sarah's various deficiencies of character. Miss Marple purchased a small box of chocolates appropriate for a condolence call and made her way up the hill to Blackthorne Manor. The house looked different in the morning light, as though the violence of the previous afternoon had altered its fundamental character. The gardens, so carefully maintained, seemed reproachful. The windows reflected the sun like blank eyes. Hartley answered the door, his expression even more carefully neutral than usual. Miss Marple, we were expecting Inspector Craddock, but not. I hope I'm not intruding, Mr. Hartley. I merely wished to pay my respects and offer my condolences to the family. Something flickered in Hartley's eyes, relief, perhaps, or possibly resignation. Mr. David Blackthorne arrived an hour ago. I believe he's in the study with Mr. Cresswell, discussing arrangements. If you'd care to wait in the drawing room. Miss Marple allowed herself to be shown into the drawing room, where she had a few precious minutes alone. She used them well, observing the room with the thoroughness of an experienced detective. The porcelain shepherdesses were positioned with mathematical precision. The photograph albums were arranged chronologically. The writing desk by the window was locked. She tested it discreetly, but its surface bore the slight discoloration that suggested frequent use. Miss Marple. The voice belonged to a man in his mid-30s, tall and well-dressed, with the kind of face that suggested intelligence and a certain ruthlessness. I'm David Blackthorne. Hartley mentioned you wished to offer condolences. That's very kind. His tone suggested it was anything but kind, that it was, in fact, an intrusion he was too well-bred to explicitly reject. I was present at the garden party, Miss Marple explained. Your aunt was gracious enough to invite me, and I felt it appropriate to express my sympathies in person. Such a terrible tragedy. Tragedy. David Blackthorne's laugh was bitter. It was murder, Miss Marple. Let's not prettify it with euphemisms. Someone poisoned my aunt, and from what the inspector tells me, the most obvious suspect is that fool of a housemaid. Sarah Jennings does seem to be the focus of considerable attention, Miss Marple agreed, though I understand she maintains her innocence. They all do, don't they? David crossed to the window, his back to her. Sarah, Hartley, even that ridiculous man Cresswell, they all claimed they had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, my aunt is dead, and I'm left to clean up the mess. It must be very difficult for you. Were you and your aunt close? Close. He turned, and Miss Marple saw genuine emotion in his face for the first time. We were complicated. She was the only family I had left after my parents died. She paid for my education, set me up in business, but she was never what you'd call affectionate. Everything was conditional with Aunt Lavinia. Love, approval, money, all of it came with strings attached. And yet you visited her. When summoned, which was frequently, his tone had returned to its earlier bitterness. She enjoyed having power over people, Miss Marple. She'd dangle her fortune like a carrot, constantly threatening to change her will, to cut people off, to redistribute her wealth according to whatever whim had seized her that particular week. That must have been exhausting for everyone concerned. Exhausting, humiliating, and ultimately pointless. She's dead now, and the will stands as it was. I inherit, though I'd rather have her alive than have her money. He paused, as though surprised by his own honesty. That probably sounds suspicious, doesn't it? The main beneficiary claiming he'd prefer the deceased alive. It sounds human, Miss Marple replied gently. Money is necessary, but it rarely compensates for loss. Before David could respond, the door opened and Martin Cresswell entered, his solicitor's briefcase in hand. He stopped short upon seeing Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I didn't realize you were here. I came to pay my respects. I hope I haven't interrupted anything important. No, no. We were just discussing the funeral arrangements. Cresswell's professional demeanor had reasserted itself, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his briefcase. A terrible business. Absolutely terrible. You were Mrs. Blackthorne's solicitor? Miss Marple inquired. For the past 3 months, yes. I took over from old Hutchinson in Milchester when he... Retired. Mrs. Blackthorne preferred to work with someone more local. How convenient that you had recently moved to the village. Something in her tone made Cresswell's eyes sharpen. Convenient. Merely an observation, Mr. Cresswell. It must be distressing to lose a client so soon after acquiring her. Mrs. Blackthorne was an important client, Cresswell agreed carefully. Her affairs were complex, and she had very specific ideas about how her estate should be managed, including recent changes to her will, I understand. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. David Blackthorne turned from the window, his expression suddenly guarded. How do you know about that? Inspector Craddock mentioned it, Miss Marple replied with perfect innocence. I hope I haven't spoken out of turn. These things do become public knowledge eventually, I suppose. Cresswell and David exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. The proposed changes were never executed, Cresswell said firmly. Mrs. Blackthorne died before signing the new will. Therefore, the existing will remains valid, and Mr. Blackthorne inherits as originally specified. How fortunate for Mr. Blackthorne, Miss Marple observed. Fortunate. David's voice was sharp. My aunt is dead, Miss Marple. I'd hardly call that fortunate, regardless of the financial implications. Asterisk, of course not. Forgive me, I sometimes speak without proper consideration. Miss Marple rose, gathering her handbag with the fussy precision of elderly women everywhere. I should be going. Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackthorne. Please accept my sincere condolences. Hartley appeared to show her out, his timing so perfect that Miss Marple suspected he had been listening at the door. As they walked toward the entrance hall, she spoke quietly. Mr. Hartley, I wonder if I might ask you something rather impertinent. His expression remained carefully neutral. Of course, Miss Marple. You receive a legacy under Mrs. Blackthorne's will, I understand. £20,000. Hartley's composure cracked, just slightly. The inspector mentioned that, did he? Yes, Mrs. Blackthorne was generous in that regard. After 15 years of service, it seems appropriate. You must have been very loyal. I endeavored to give satisfaction. The formal phrase carried undertones Miss Marple couldn't quite interpret. And Sarah Jennings, how long has she been in service here? 3 years. She's a good worker when she applies herself, though Mrs. Blackthorne found her presumptuous at times. Presumptuous in what way? Hartley hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against the knowledge that the information would emerge eventually. Sarah had certain ambitions above her station. She would sometimes act as though she were mistress of the house rather than a housemaid. Mrs. Blackthorne found it intolerable. I see. And you, Mr. Hartley, did you find it intolerable? The butler's expression became unreadable. I found it imprudent, Miss Marple. When one is in service, one learns that certain boundaries exist for good reason. Sarah never learned that lesson. As Miss Marple walked back down the hill toward the village, she reflected on the morning's conversations. David Blackthorne, who stood to inherit millions, claimed he would prefer his aunt alive, a sentiment that might be genuine or might be excellent theatre. Martin Cresswell, the solicitor, seemed nervous in a way that suggested more than professional concern. And Hartley, the faithful butler, spoke of Sarah Jennings with a disdain that seemed personal rather than merely professional. 3 men, each with their own relationship to the deceased, and somewhere among their carefully constructed statements and practiced discretion, Miss Marple suspected lay the truth about who had served poison with tea. By Monday afternoon, the village consensus had solidified around Sarah Jennings as the murderer. The logic was impeccable in its simplicity. She had prepared the tea. She had poured Mrs. Blackthorne's cup. She had been threatened with dismissal without a reference. Opportunity, access, and motive, the holy trinity of criminal investigation. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that village consensus was often inversely proportional to actual truth. She found Sarah in the small cottage she shared with her widowed mother on the edge of the village. The girl answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and an expression of such abject misery that even the most hardened skeptic would have felt sympathy. "Miss Marple," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I suppose you've come to stare at the murderess like everyone else. I've come to talk to you, my dear. May I come in?" Sarah's mother, thin, anxious woman who worked as a seamstress, hovered in the background as Miss Marple settled into the cottage's small sitting room. The furniture was old but scrupulously clean, the kind of genteel poverty that worked desperately to maintain respectability. "I didn't do it," Sarah said before Miss Marple could speak. "I know everyone thinks I did, but I swear on my mother's life, I didn't poison Mrs. Blackthorne. I wouldn't. I couldn't." "I believe you," Miss Marple said simply. Sarah's eyes widened. "You do?" "Yes. Though my belief is not based on sentiment, but on observation. The poison used was sophisticated. Spectocratic believes it may have been digitalis or something similar. Extracted and concentrated. Such things require knowledge and resources that you simply don't possess. Then why does everyone think I did it? Because you're convenient, my dear. You had the opportunity. You were seen to be nervous, and Mrs. Blackthorne had threatened to dismiss you. From the outside, it appears obvious." "It wasn't like that," Sarah protested. "Yes, Mrs. Blackthorne was angry with me, but I wasn't going to be dismissed. At least, not anymore." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Not anymore." Sarah bit her lip, clearly weighing whether to share confidential information. 3 days before the garden party, Mrs. Blackthorne called me into her study. I thought she was going to give me notice, but instead she apologized. I was shocked too. She said she'd been hasty, that she understood I was young and had made mistakes, but that everyone deserved a second chance. She said I could stay on, and that she'd even consider increasing my wages. "How extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she give any reason for this change of heart?" "She said something about making amends, about wanting to ensure that the people who had served her well were properly taken care of. It was so unlike her that I didn't know what to think." Miss Marple considered this information carefully. 3 days before her death, Mrs. Blackthorne had summoned her solicitor to discuss changing her will. On the same day, she had pardoned Sarah and promised her better wages. It suggested a systematic review of her affairs, a settling of accounts. "Sarah, I need you to think very carefully about the garden party. You poured Mrs. Blackthorne's tea yourself." "Yes. I'd prepared the service in the kitchen. Mr. Hartley insisted everything be perfect. I brought out the tea tray and began pouring for the guests. When I got to Mrs. Blackthorne, she requested Earl Grey specifically, so I made sure to use the correct teapot. There were multiple teapots. 3, English breakfast, Earl Grey, and green tea. Mrs. Blackthorne always drank Earl Grey in the afternoon, and who would have known that?" Sarah shrugged helplessly. Everyone who knew her. She was very particular about her tea. Mr. Hartley certainly knew. Mr. Cresswell had been to tea several times and would have observed it, and anyone who'd spent time at the manor would have noticed. What about the guests? Did anyone approach the tea table before you served Mrs. Blackthorne? Sarah frowned, trying to remember. Several people came near. Lady Pemberton wanted more milk. Colonel Weatherby asked for sugar. Miss Foster, Dr. Foster's daughter, she came very close, said she wanted to see if there were any lemon biscuits left. And Mr. Cresswell, he was standing near the table for a while, checking his mobile phone. Miss Foster, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Amanda Foster. What can you tell me about her, Sarah? The girl's expression darkened. We used to be friends. Grew up together, went to the same school. But things changed when I got engaged to Peter. Changed how? Sarah looked away, her cheeks flushing. Amanda had expectations about Peter. They'd courted a bit when we were younger. Nothing serious, but she thought they might marry eventually. When Peter proposed to me instead, she was furious. Said I'd stolen him, that I was a scheming little opportunist. That must have been very unpleasant. It was awful. She stopped speaking to me entirely. And then, about a month ago, she started working at Blackthorne Manor. Miss Marple's needles stopped entirely. Amanda Foster worked for Mrs. Blackthorne. Not as a servant. Mrs. Blackthorne hired her to help catalogue the library and organise her correspondence. Amanda's quite clever with books and papers. She studied library science at university. She was there 2 or 3 times a week. And did you interact with her during those visits? As little as possible. She'd make snide comments, suggest to Mrs. Blackthorne that I was shirking my duties. I think she was trying to get me dismissed. Sarah's voice broke slightly. Maybe she succeeded, just not in the way she intended. Maybe she killed Mrs. Blackthorne and arranged things so I'd be blamed. It was a theory, Miss Marple reflected, though perhaps too obvious to be the truth. Amanda Foster had motive jealousy over a Menand opportunity, having been at the garden party and familiar with the household. But would a young woman trained in library science possess the knowledge to extract and concentrate digitalis? And more importantly, what would she gain from Mrs. Blackthorne's death? Sarah, Miss Marple said gently, I want you to stop worrying about being blamed. The truth has a way of emerging, though it often takes time and patience. In the meanwhile, try to remember every detail from that afternoon. Who spoke to whom, who moved where, who seemed nervous or excited or unusually calm. These small observations may prove crucial. After leaving Sarah's cottage, Miss Marple made her way to the Foster residence, a comfortable house near the village green where Dr. Foster maintained both his practice and his home. Amanda answered the door herself, her pretty face hardening when she saw her visitor. Miss Marple, if you've come to lecture me about Christian charity towards Sarah Jennings, you can save your breath. I've come to ask you some questions, my dear. The inspector will undoubtedly be along to do the same. But I thought a preliminary conversation might be beneficial for everyone concerned. Amanda hesitated, then stepped aside. You'd better come in then. They settled in the Fosters' drawing room, where Amanda sat with the rigid posture of someone prepared for confrontation. I suppose Sarah's been telling tales about me. She mentioned that you had been friends, and that there was a falling out over her engagement. Friends? Amanda's laugh was bitter. We were friends until she showed her true colors. Peter and I had an understanding, nothing formal, but everyone knew we'd marry eventually. Then Sarah came along with her simpering ways and her ridiculous fluttering, and suddenly Peter couldn't see straight. Young men can be susceptible to feminine charm, Miss Marple observed mildly. She didn't charm him, she trapped him. Got herself into a position where he felt obligated to propose. And now she's playing the victim, pretending she's innocent when everyone knows she murdered Mrs. Blackthorne. Do you believe Sarah capable of murder? The question seemed to give Amanda pause. I don't know. I wouldn't have thought so before all this. Sarah's weak, not vicious. But people surprise you, don't they? Indeed they do. You were working for Mrs. Blackthorne, I understand. Cataloguing her library, yes. She had an extraordinary collection, first editions, rare books, correspondence with literary figures. It was actually quite fascinating work. And did you have access to Mrs. Blackthorne's private study? Amanda's expression became wary. Sometimes, when she needed documents or wanted to discuss the collection. Why? I'm merely trying to understand the household dynamics. Mrs. Blackthorne seems to have been a woman with many acquaintances but few genuine friends. She was difficult, Amanda admitted, demanding, critical, constantly finding fault. But she paid well, and the work was interesting. I certainly had no reason to want her dead, even though her death has resulted in considerable suspicion falling on Sarah Jennings. The silence that followed was profound. Amanda stood abruptly, her face flushed. That's a horrible thing to suggest. Yes, I dislike Sarah. Yes, I think she's a manipulative little schemer who stole my But I didn't kill Mrs. Blackthorne to frame her. I didn't kill anyone. I'm sure you didn't, dear, Miss Marple said soothingly, though her mind was working rapidly. Amanda's vehemence was interesting to strong, perhaps, for mere professional concern. Tell me, when you were at the tea table during the garden party, did you notice anything unusual? Amanda calmed slightly, considering the question. Not really. It was chaotic, everyone wanting something different, Sarah rushing about trying to accommodate everyone. I asked about lemon biscuits, couldn't find any, moved away. That's all. And where were you when Mrs. Blackthorne collapsed? Near the rose garden, talking to Colonel Weatherby about his time in India. Boring as watching paint dry, but I was being polite. After departing the Foster residence, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her mind assembling the pieces of the puzzle with the methodical care she applied to her knitting. Sarah Jennings, threatened with dismissal but subsequently pardoned, with access to the tea but lacking sophisticated knowledge. Amanda Forster, scorned in love and employed by the victim, with access to the household but no clear motive for murder. David Blackthorne, primary beneficiary of the unchanged will, with powerful motive but ironclad alibi. The obvious suspects all had flaws in their potential guilt, which suggested, Miss Marple reflected, that the actual murderer was someone less obvious, someone who had remained in the shadows while attention focused elsewhere, someone, perhaps, who had been overlooked precisely because their presence was so unremarkable. Tuesday brought rain, a steady, miserable drizzle that matched the village's mood. Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary headquarters in the parish hall, where he methodically interviewed everyone who had attended the garden party. Miss Marple, observing this process from the tea shop across the street, reflected that official investigations were necessary but often missed the subtle currents that flowed beneath public statements. She had spent the morning in her cottage, reviewing her notes, not written notes, which she found unnecessarily conspicuous, but mental ones. The kind she had been compiling for decades of observing human nature. 3 details kept nagging at her attention. Small things that didn't fit the emerging narrative. First, there was Hartley's moment of relief when Mrs. Blackthorne collapsed. Relief suggested he had been anticipating something, which implied foreknowledge. But foreknowledge of what? The murder itself, or merely some other unpleasant event? Second, Amanda Foster's claim that she was near the rose garden when Mrs. Blackthorne died. Miss Marple distinctly remembered seeing Amanda much closer to the tea table, though the girl had moved away quickly after the collapse. Why lie about something so trivial? Third, and perhaps most interesting, was something Sarah had mentioned in passing. Mrs. Blackthorne's sudden change of heart about dismissing her. The timing 3 days before the murder, coinciding with the summoning of the solicitors, suggested a systematic re-evaluation. But re-evaluation prompted by what? Miss Marple decided it was time to pay another visit to Blackthorne Manor. She arrived just after lunch, this time without prior announcement. Hartley answered the door with his usual professional courtesy, though she detected a slight wariness in his expression. Miss Marple, I'm afraid Mr. David has gone to London for the day. If you wished to speak with him, actually, Mr. Hartley, I was hoping to speak with you. The butler's composure slipped for just a moment. With me. If you can spare a few minutes. I promise not to keep you from your duties. He showed her into a small sitting room off the main hall, clearly the domain of staff rather than family. Miss Marple settled into a chair and observed him with her mild, relentless gaze. Mr. Hartley, I've been thinking about our previous conversation, and there's something that puzzles me. You spoke of Sarah's presumption, her tendency to act above her station. Can you give me a specific example? Hartley hesitated, then sat down with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to sitting in the presence of guests. It wasn't any one thing, Miss Marple. More an accumulation of small transgressions. She would linger in Mrs. Blackthorne's private rooms longer than necessary. She would wear Mrs. Blackthorne's perfume. I recognized the scent. She would answer the telephone and represent herself as Mrs. Blackthorne's personal assistant rather than her housemaid. The behavior of someone with ambitions. Precisely. Sarah seemed to believe that if she acted the part of a lady, she might somehow become one. And Mrs. Blackthorne discovered these transgressions. Some of them, I may have, brought certain matters to her attention. I see. Miss Marple's tone remained perfectly neutral, but something in her expression made Hartley shift uncomfortably. You mentioned that Mrs. Blackthorne was initially going to dismiss Sarah, but then changed her mind. Do you know what prompted that change? I'm afraid not. Mrs. Blackthorne was capricious in her decisions. She would threaten and rage one day, then be perfectly forgiving the next. But this wasn't caprice, was it? This was 3 days before her death, when she was systematically reviewing her affairs. She summoned her solicitor, changed her will or intended to and pardoned Sarah. That suggests deliberation rather than whim. Hartley said nothing. His expression carefully neutral. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but inexorable. I wonder, Mr. Hartley, if Mrs. Blackthorne had discovered something that made her reevaluate not just Sarah's behavior, but the behavior of others in her household. I couldn't say. Miss Marple couldn't or won't. When he didn't respond, she changed tacks. Tell me about Mrs. Blackthorne's study. I noticed it was locked when I visited previously. Mrs. Blackthorne was very particular about her privacy. The study contains personal papers, financial documents. It's kept locked, except when I'm cleaning. And you have the key. I have a key, yes. As did Mrs. Blackthorne. And there's a spare in the kitchen safe. So 3 keys total. Yes. Has anyone requested access to the study since Mrs. Blackthorne's death? Hartley's pause was fractional but telling. Mr. David, naturally. He's been reviewing his aunt's papers to prepare for the funeral and settle her affairs. And has he found everything in order? I believe so, though. Hartley stopped, clearly debating whether to continue, though Miss Marple prompted gently, though he did mention that some documents seemed to be missing. Nothing important, he said. Just correspondence that Mrs. Blackthorne had referenced in recent conversations, but which he couldn't locate. How interesting. What sort of correspondence? Mr. David didn't specify. Hartley stood, reasserting his professional boundaries. Miss Marple, if there's nothing else, I really must return to my duties. There's a great deal to organize with the funeral arrangements. Miss Marple allowed herself to be shown out, but not before observing the kitchen as they passed through it. Sarah had mentioned 3 teapots English breakfast, Earl Grey, and green tea. They sat on a shelf, gleaming silver vessels that represented Mrs. Blackthorne's exacting standards. But there was a 4th vessel as well, tucked slightly behind the others. A small silver pitcher, perhaps for cream or milk. Mr. Hartley, Miss Marple said, pausing, that 4th vessel there. What is it used for? That? It's a honey pot. Mrs. Blackthorne took honey in her Earl Grey sometimes, particularly when her throat was troubling her. And did she have honey in her tea at the garden party? Hartley frowned, considering. I don't believe so. It was a warm day. She typically preferred honey only in winter, I see. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. As Miss Marple walked back to the village, her mind was racing. A honey pot used occasionally in Earl Grey tea. Earl Grey that Mrs. Blackthorne drank exclusively in the afternoon. Earl Grey that only she consumed from the 3 teapots available at the garden party. If poison had been placed in the Earl Grey teapot, everyone who drank from it would have been affected. But only Mrs. Blackthorne died, which meant the poison was in something only she consumed. The honey pot would be perfect, specific to her tea, specific to her preferences. But the honey pot hadn't been used at the garden party, which meant either Miss Marple's theory was wrong, or the murderer had another method of ensuring only Mrs. Blackthorne consumed the poison. She was still pondering this when she encountered Martin Cresswell outside the post office. The solicitor looked haggard, as though he hadn't slept properly in days. Mr. Cresswell, Miss Marple said pleasantly. How are you managing? As well as can be expected, he replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. The police have been extremely thorough in their questioning. I suppose I'm a natural suspect, the solicitor, who is in the process of changing the will. Though you benefit not at all from Mrs. Blackthorne's death, Miss Marple observed. On the contrary, I lose a valuable client and gain a great deal of suspicion. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. Miss Marple, may I ask you something? Inspector Craddock mentioned that you've been helpful in previous investigations. Do you believe Sarah Jennings is guilty? I believe the evidence against Sarah is circumstantial at best, Miss Marple replied carefully. Why do you ask? Because I don't think she did it either. Cresswell glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. I've been going through Mrs. Blackthorne's papers. David asked me to help sort things out. And I've found something disturbing. What sort of something? Letters, hidden in her study, not with her regular correspondence. Letters that suggest Mrs. Blackthorne was being blackmailed. Miss Marple felt a surge of interest, though her expression remained placid. Blackmailed. About what? That's just it. The letters are vague, all innuendo and veiled threats. But they demanded money, and from what I can tell from her bank records, she'd been paying. Not huge amounts, £500 a month, but consistently over the past 6 months. Did she report this to the police? Apparently not. And I don't know who was blackmailing her or why. The letters were unsigned, delivered by hand according to the postmarks. Someone local, almost certainly. Have you shown these letters to Inspector Craddock? Not yet. I wanted to be certain they were relevant before complicating an already complex investigation. But Miss Marple, if someone was blackmailing Mrs. Blackthorne, and if she decided to stop paying or threatened to expose the blackmailer, that would indeed constitute a powerful motive for murder, Miss Marple finished. Mr. Cresswell, you must take these letters to Inspector Craddock immediately. This changes everything. After Cresswell hurried off toward the parish hall, Miss Marple stood in the rain, her mind assembling pieces with renewed urgency. Blackmail suggested secrets. Secrets suggested scandal. And scandal, in a small village, was the most potent currency of all. Mrs. Blackthorne had been re-evaluating her affairs 3 days before her death. She had pardoned Sarah, summoned her solicitor, planned to change her will. Had she also decided to stop paying blackmail? Or worse, had she discovered who was blackmailing her and confronted them? The devil, Miss Marple reflected, was always in the details. And the detail that mattered most was not who had access to the tea service, but who had access to Mrs. Blackthorne's secrets by Wednesday. The blackmail letters had become public knowledge, or at least as public as anything became in St. Mary Mead, which meant that everyone knew while pretending they didn't. Inspector Craddock had retrieved the letters from Cresswell and was now conducting a fresh round of interviews with anyone who might have had reason to blackmail. Mrs. Blackthorn. Miss Marple had spent the morning at the lending library, where Mrs. Carmichael, the librarian, maintained files of old newspaper clippings about local families. It was remarkable, Miss Marple reflected, how much history was preserved in provincial newspapers, marriages, deaths, and the occasional scandal that disrupted the usual pattern of life. She found what she was looking for in a clipping from 17 years ago. Local industrialist dies in tragic accident. Geoffrey Blackthorne, Mrs. Blackthorne's late husband, had died when his car went off a bridge during a rainstorm. The inquest had returned a verdict of accidental death, though Miss Marple noted that the article mentioned concerns about Mr. Blackthorne's state of mind in the weeks preceding his death. Another clipping. From 20 years ago, Manor House staff member dismissed. A brief notice about a housemaid named Catherine Hartley who had been let go from Blackthorne Manor for unspecified reasons. The surname caught Miss Marple's attention. Hartley was not an uncommon name, but still, she was still pondering this when Inspector Craddock arrived at the library, looking for her with the slightly bemused expression of someone who had learned that Miss Marple was often several steps ahead of official investigations. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "Doing research?" "Just browsing, Inspector. Old newspapers can be quite illuminating." "Have you made progress with the blackmail angle?" "Some. The letters are carefully worded. No explicit accusations. Just vague references to past indiscretions and information that might prove embarrassing. Mrs. Blackthorne had been paying £500 monthly for 6 months, always in cash, left at various locations around the village." "Dead drops," Miss Marple murmured. "How very cloak and dagger, quite." The last payment was supposed to be made the day before the garden party, but according to her bank records, Mrs. Blackthorne didn't withdraw the cash. It appears she may have decided to stop paying, which would certainly anger the blackmailer. Do you have any idea what the indiscretion might have been? Craddock hesitated. We've been looking into Mrs. Blackthorne's past. Her husband's death was ruled accidental, but there were rumors at the time that it might have been suicide. If those rumors were true, and if Mrs. Blackthorne had somehow contributed to his state of mind, that would indeed be embarrassing, though hardly worth murder after so many years, unless there was more to it. We're also investigating the possibility that the accident wasn't an accident at all. Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly. You suspect Mrs. Blackthorne might have been responsible for her husband's death. I suspect that someone believed she was, and was willing to blackmail her over it. Whether that belief had any basis in reality, I can't yet say. Craddock pulled out his notebook. There's something else. We've been looking into the staff at Blackthorne Manor, present and past. Thomas Hartley, the butler. Did you know his sister Catherine worked at the manor 20 years ago? I had just discovered that. Miss Marple indicated the newspaper clipping. She was dismissed for unspecified reasons. Reasons that, according to our inquiries, involved theft. Small items at first, a brooch, some cash from a desk drawer, but eventually something more valuable. A sapphire necklace that had belonged to Geoffrey Blackthorne's mother. Catherine Hartley was dismissed without a reference and left the village in disgrace. And Thomas Hartley came to work at the manor 15 years ago after his sister's dismissal. Exactly, which raises interesting questions about loyalty and motive. Was he genuinely devoted to Mrs. Blackthorne, or was there resentment festering beneath the professional facade? Miss Marple considered this. The legacy Mrs. Blackthorne left him £20,000, that's substantial, but not extraordinary for 15 years of service, unless he felt entitled to more. Unless he knew something about Mrs. Blackthorne that made him believe he deserved compensation. You think Hartley might have been the blackmailer? It's a possibility. He had intimate knowledge of the household, access to Mrs. Blackthorne's private affairs, and a family history that might inspire resentment. But proving it is another matter entirely. After Craddock departed to continue his investigation, Miss Marple remained in the library, thinking. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the picture was still incomplete. Mrs. Blackthorne had secrets possibly involving her husband's death. Someone had been blackmailing her over those secrets. She had decided to stop paying and to reevaluate her affairs, including her will and her treatment of staff, and someone had murdered her. To prevent those reevaluations from causing inconvenient revelations, that evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Amanda Foster appeared at her door, her eyes red from crying, her usual poise entirely absent. Miss Marple, I need to tell you something. I lied before, and I can't. I can't keep lying, not when someone might be convicted of murder because of it. Miss Marple ushered the girl inside and prepared proper tea, not the poisoned variety, while Amanda collected herself. I wasn't near the rose garden when Mrs. Blackthorne died, Amanda said finally. I was at the tea table. I did go there looking for lemon biscuits, but that's not why I stayed. Why did you stay, dear? Because I saw something. Someone put something in the honey pot, the little silver pitcher that Mrs. Blackthorne used for her Earl Grey. Miss Marple's hands stilled on the teapot. Who did you see? That's the thing I couldn't tell clearly. There were so many people around, and I was at an angle. I saw a hand, wearing a glove, just for a moment. They opened the honey pot, dropped something in it looked like powder from a small envelope, then closed it again. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds, and you said nothing. Amanda's face crumpled. I was afraid. What if they saw me seeing them? What if they decided I was a threat? And then later, after Mrs. Blackthorne died, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it wasn't important. But the police keep saying the poison was in her tea, and I keep thinking about that honeypot, and I can't sleep. I can't think. You did the right thing telling me, Miss Marple said firmly. But now you must tell Inspector Craddock. This is crucial evidence, but I don't know who it was. I can't identify them. All I saw was a hand with a glove. What kind of glove? White, like the kind servers wear, or butlers. Miss Marple felt a chill. Hartley had been wearing gloves at the garden party, formal white gloves appropriate to his position. But so had Sarah, as she served tea, and possibly others who were helping with the service. Amanda, think carefully. Was there anything distinctive about this hand? Any rings, watches, scars? Amanda closed her eyes, trying to remember. No rings, but, wait. There was something on the wrist, just visible above the glove. It looked like a tattoo. Just the edge of it. I couldn't see what it was. A tattoo, Miss Marple repeated. That is interesting indeed. After Amanda left, having promised to go directly to Inspector Craddock with her information, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window and thought about tattoos. They were increasingly common, of course, but among the older generation, the generation of butlers and long-time staff, they were less usual, unless one had served in the military, where tattoos were practically traditional. Hartley had mentioned military training in his posture. Miss Marple made a mental note to discover whether he had actually served, and if so, whether he bore tattoos as mementos of that service. The investigation was narrowing, focusing on Hartley as the most likely suspect. He had motive resentment over his sister's disgrace. He had opportunity access to the entire household. He had the means knowledge of Mrs. Blackthorne's habits and access to her tea service. And now, possibly, he had been identified placing poison in the honey pot. And yet, Miss Marple felt a nagging doubt. Something about this neat solution bothered her. It was too obvious, too convenient, much like the case against Sarah Jennings, which had appeared overwhelming until one examined it closely. She had learned over decades of observation that the most obvious solution was often correct, but that when murder was involved, the obvious was frequently a carefully constructed facade. Someone had killed Mrs. Blackthorne with considerable planning and sophistication. Someone had served poison with tea, knowing exactly how to ensure only the intended victim would consume it. Someone had arranged matters so that suspicion would fall on convenient scapegoats first. Sarah, now Hartley. The question was not who had the best opportunity, but who had the most to gain. And that, Miss Marple suspected, was a question that required looking beyond the immediate circumstances to the larger patterns of motive and opportunity. Thursday morning brought news that electrified the village. Hartley had been arrested. Inspector Craddock had questioned him about the tattoo on his wrister, regimental insignia from his service in the Royal Marines, and about his access to the honey pot under pressure. Hartley had admitted to harboring resentment toward Mrs. Blackthorne over his sister's dismissal. Though he vehemently denied murder, the case appeared closed. The village consensus shifted smoothly from Sarah to Hartley, with the same certainty it had shown in the previous direction. Only Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She was in her garden, ostensibly weeding, but actually thinking, when she heard raised voices from the lane. Dr. Foster and his daughter Amanda were engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument. "Can't believe you went to that meddling old woman instead of coming to me." Dr. Foster's voice carried clearly over the hedge. She was kind, Dad. She listened, and she told me to go to the police, which I did. You should never have gotten involved in the first place. If that murderer had known you saw something, you could have been in danger. But Hartley's been arrested now. It's over, is it? Dr. Foster's tone was strange, strained. Is it really over, Amanda? There was a long silence, then Amanda's voice, quieter now. What do you mean? Nothing. Never mind, just stay out of it now. No more playing detective. Promise me. Miss Marple couldn't hear Amanda's response, but the conversation troubled her. Dr. Foster's reaction seemed excessive for a father concerned about his daughter's safety. There was something else in his tone. Was it fear? Guilt? She was still pondering this when Mrs. Dunstable appeared at her gate, breathless with excitement. Have you heard? They've found more letters in Mrs. Blackthorne's study, hidden in a secret compartment in her desk. What sort of letters, Mrs. Dunstable? Love letters, they're saying. From years ago, between Mrs. Blackthorne and someone who wasn't her husband, the inspectors being very close-mouthed about it. But my cousin's daughter works at the police station, and she says they're investigating whether the affair had anything to do with Mr. Blackthorne's death. After Mrs. Dunstable departed to spread this news throughout the village, Miss Marple sat very still, her mind working rapidly. Love letters, an affair, a husband who died in suspicious circumstances, and now, 17 years later, a wife murdered by poison. She needed to speak with Inspector Craddock immediately. She found him at the parish hall, looking exhausted and frustrated. Miss Marple, he said wearily, I suppose you've heard about the letters. I have. May I ask who wrote them? We don't know yet. They're signed only with initials JF. The affair appears to have taken place about 20 years ago, shortly before Mr. Blackthorne's death. The letter suggests that Mrs. Blackthorne wanted to leave her husband, that she and this JF had planned a future together, but she didn't leave. No, her husband died, and she inherited everything. The affair apparently ended soon after. JF, Miss Marple murmured. Do you know anyone in the village with those initials? That's the problem. There are several possibilities. James Farley, who runs the garage, Julia Freeman, who teaches at the primary school, and Craddock hesitated, and Dr. John Foster. The name hung in the air between them. Miss Marple thought of the conversation she'd overheard, Dr. Foster's strange intensity, his insistence that Amanda stay out of the investigation. Dr. Foster would have been in his 30s 20 years ago, Miss Marple said slowly. A young doctor, newly established in the village. Mrs. Blackthorne would have been in her early 40s, wealthy, perhaps unhappy in her marriage. It's speculation, Craddock warned. The letters don't prove anything about who killed whom, or why. They just suggest that Mrs. Blackthorne's past was more complicated than anyone realized. Inspector, has it occurred to you that Hartley might not be guilty? Craddock sighed. It's occurred to me, yes. The evidence against him is strong but not conclusive. He had motive and opportunity, and he matches the description of the person Amanda saw at the tea table. But there's something off about the whole thing. He admits to resenting Mrs. Blackthorne, admits to knowing about the honeypot, but his denial of murder has the ring of truth. Then perhaps we should consider who else benefits from the current situation. You mean who benefits from Hartley being arrested? Precisely. Sarah is no longer the primary suspect. David Blackthorne has inherited his £3 million without further complications. The real murderer remains free while an innocent man sits in custody. But who is the real murderer, Miss Marple? If not Sarah and not Hartley, then who? Someone clever enough to create multiple layers of misdirection. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household and its inhabitants. Someone who understood that the best way to get away with murder was to ensure that suspicion fell on others. Before Craddock could respond, his mobile phone rang. He answered it, his expression growing increasingly grave as he listened. When he ended the call, he looked at Miss Marple with something like shock. That was the forensics laboratory. They've completed their analysis of the teapot and the honeypot from the garden party, and there was no poison in either one. The poison was in Mrs. Blackthorne's teacup, itself placed there directly, not in any of the service vessels. Miss Marple felt the pieces clicking into place, which means the poison wasn't added by someone at the tea table during service. It was added earlier to a specific cup that was designated for Mrs. Blackthorne. But Sarah poured the tea directly from the pot into whatever cups were available. How could anyone ensure Mrs. Blackthorne received a specific cup? Unless, Miss Marple said slowly, Mrs. Blackthorne always used a specific cup. Her personal cup, perhaps. One she brought with her, or one that was always reserved for her use. Craddock grabbed his jacket. We need to go back to Blackthorne Manor, now. They arrived to find David Blackthorne present, along with Martin Cresswell. Both men looked startled by the inspector's urgent arrival. Mr. Blackthorne, Craddock said without preamble, did your aunt have a personal teacup? One she always used. David frowned. Yes, actually. A Royal Dalton cup with a rose pattern. It had belonged to her mother. She was very particular about it wouldn't let anyone else use it, insisted it be kept separate from the regular service. And where is this cup normally kept? In the china cabinet in the drawing room. It would have been taken out for the garden party along with the rest of the tea service, who would have had access to it before the party. Anyone in the household, really. Sarah would have been responsible for setting up the service. Hartley might have overseen it. I suppose anyone who visited the house in the days before the party could have accessed the cabinet. Miss Marple spoke for the first time. Mr. Blackthorne, in the 3 days before the garden party, who visited this house. David considered. Well, there was Cresswell, obviously, for the will discussion. Dr. Forster came to check on Aunt Lavinia. She'd been complaining of headaches. Amanda Foster was here, working on the library. Colonel Weatherby stopped by to discuss some village committee business. Lady Pemberton came for tea one afternoon. It was quite a busy few days, actually. Dr. Foster, Miss Marple repeated. Did he have access to the drawing room? I suppose so. Aunt Lavinia received him there for consultation. She preferred it to being examined in her bedroom, said it was more civilized. Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged glances. The pattern was emerging with terrible clarity. Dr. John Foster, who might have been Mrs. Blackthorne's lover 20 years ago, who had access to the house and to the drawing room where the teacup was kept, who had medical knowledge and access to poisons through his practice, who had been overheard telling his daughter to stay out of the investigation with suspicious intensity. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, I believe we need to speak with Dr. Foster immediately, and it would be wise to bring several constables. If I'm correct about what we're going to discover, he may prove dangerous when cornered. The confrontation with Dr. Foster could not be immediate. Inspector Craddock needed evidence, not merely suspicion, no matter how well-founded. The fact that Foster had the initials JF and had visited Blackthorn Manor before the party proved nothing. The love letters proved an affair, but not murder. The teacup revelation narrowed the opportunity window, but didn't definitively identify the poisoner. What was needed, Miss Marple reflected, was for the murderer to reveal himself through action rather than deduction. And for that, a certain amount of theatrical risk would be required. She proposed her plan to Inspector Craddock that evening. In the privacy of his temporary office, he listened with growing alarm and then, reluctantly, with acceptance. "It's dangerous," he said flatly. "If you're right about Foster, you'd be putting yourself directly in harm's way." "I'm an elderly woman with a reputation for harmless nosiness," Miss Marple replied. "Dr. Foster would no more suspect me of setting a trap than he would suspect his teapot of doing so. Besides, we need a confession. Your evidence is circumstantial at best. I don't like it. Neither do I, particularly. But I liked the alternative, less Hartley convicted of a murder he didn't commit, and the real killer free to potentially harm others who might stumble onto the truth. The plan was simple in concept, perilous in execution. Miss Marple would visit Dr. Foster under the pretext of seeking medical advice. During the visit, she would casually mention that she had discovered something interesting about Mrs. Blackthorn's teacups, something that proved who had poisoned it. She would claim to have kept this information to herself while she considered what to do, but had decided to consult with the doctor about whether such knowledge created an ethical obligation. The hope was that Foster, believing Miss Marple had evidence of his guilt, would attempt to silence her or at least reveal himself through his reaction. Inspector Craddock and 2 constables would be positioned nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. "And if he simply calls the police himself and reports what you've told him?" Craddock asked. "Then we'll know he's innocent and we'll have to look elsewhere." "But Inspector, I don't believe he will. A guilty man, when confronted with the prospect of discovery, doesn't invite additional scrutiny. He takes action to protect himself." Friday afternoon found Miss Marple at Dr. Foster's surgery. Having made an appointment for 4 o'clock, late enough that other patients would have departed, early enough that Amanda, who worked mornings at the surgery, would still be present. Dr. Foster greeted her with professional courtesy, though Miss Marple detected a wariness in his expression. Perhaps her recent involvement in the investigation had made him cautious. "Miss Marple, Amanda mentioned you'd booked an appointment. What seems to be the trouble?" "Oh, nothing urgent, Doctor. Just my usual complaints about rheumatism and whatnot. But I confess, I had another reason for coming. I wanted to discuss something rather delicate, and I thought perhaps a doctor would understand the ethical considerations." Foster's expression became carefully neutral. "Of course. Please, sit down." Miss Marple settled into the patient chair with her characteristic fussy precision, setting her handbag beside her. "It concerns Mrs. Blackthorn's death. You know I've taken an interest in the matter habit of an old woman with too much time on her hands, I'm afraid. The police have arrested Hartley," Foster said. "I'd have thought the matter was settled." "Yes, they have arrested him. But Doctor, I've discovered something that troubles me greatly. Something about the teacup Mrs. Blackthorn drank from at the garden party." She watched his face carefully. A flicker of something alarming. Calculation passed across his features before the professional mask reasserted itself. "What about the teacup?" "Well, you see, I've been researching methods of forensic analysis, fascinating field. Really, and I learned that modern techniques can detect fingerprints even on surfaces that have been thoroughly wiped. The police took Mrs. Blackthorne's teacup into evidence, naturally, but I don't believe they've analyzed it for prints yet. They've been so focused on the tea service itself. I'm not sure I understand what this has to do with me, don't you? Miss Marple's voice remained mild, almost apologetic. The thing is, Doctor, I've been thinking about who had access to that teacup before the garden party. It was kept in the drawing room at Blackthorne Manor, and you visited there several times in the days before Mrs. Blackthorne's death. I remember seeing you there myself when I called on her 2 days before the party. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Dr. Foster's hands, Miss Marple noted, had clenched on his desk. Lots of people visited Blackthorne Manor, he said finally. That proves nothing. No, it doesn't. But combined with other evidence, the love letters, for instance, that the police found, the ones signed JF, it creates a rather compelling narrative, doesn't it? A former lover who might have felt wronged, who had medical knowledge and access to poisons, who could easily have poisoned the teacup during a house call. This is absurd. Foster stood abruptly, his professional composure cracking. Are you accusing me of murder, Miss Marple? I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Doctor. I'm merely concerned about what the evidence might suggest when it's all assembled. You see, I haven't yet told the police about seeing you at Blackthorne Manor with access to the drawing room. I wanted to think about whether it was truly relevant, whether it might not simply cause trouble for an innocent man. I thought perhaps you might help me decide what the ethical course would be. The ethical course. Foster's laugh was harsh. The ethical course would have been for Lavinia to tell the truth 20 years ago, instead of letting everyone believe Jeffrey died in an accident. The words hung in the air. Foster's face went white as he realized what he'd said. The truth about Mr. Blackthorne's death. Miss Marple prompted gently. What truth would that be, Doctor? But Foster had retreated behind silence, his expression that of a man who knows he's said too much. At that moment, Inspector Craddock entered the surgery, followed by 2 constables. Dr. John Foster, he said formally, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Mrs. Lavinia Blackthorne. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Foster didn't resist. He seemed, instead, almost relieved, as though a burden he'd carried for 20 years had finally become too heavy to bear. She killed him, he said quietly. Lavinia killed Jeffrey. Not directly, she was too clever for that. But she drove him to it, year after year of cruelty and manipulation. And when he finally couldn't take it anymore, when he drove his car off that bridge, she inherited everything and played the grieving widow. And you loved her, Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. I thought I did. Young fool that I was, I thought we'd be together after Jeffrey was gone. But she didn't want me, she wanted his money and the respectability of widowhood. She ended it immediately, told me she'd been amusing herself, that I'd been convenient but was no longer needed. So you waited 20 years and then killed her. Not for revenge, Foster's voice was bitter. For protection. 3 months ago, she contacted me. Said she was preparing her memoirs, that she planned to include our affair. To paint herself as a tragic figure driven to adultery by a cruel husband. My career would have been destroyed. My reputation, everything I'd built, her all of it, gone because of her narcissistic need to be the center of attention even from beyond the grave. So you poisoned her teacup during a house call, Craddock said. I couldn't let her destroy me. I tried reasoning with her, begging her to leave me out of her damned memoirs. She laughed. said I should have thought of consequences 20 years ago before pursuing a married woman. Foster looked at Miss Marple with something like respect. How did you know it was the teacup? Because poisoning the tea service would have been too risky. Others might have been affected. But poisoning her personal cup, the one only she used, ensured a specific victim. And you had medical knowledge to obtain and prepare digitalis, plus access to the house and to the cup. The love letters were the final piece. They established motive from 20 years ago. But the immediate motive was self-preservation. As the constables led Foster away, Amanda burst into the surgery, tears streaming down her face. She had been in the back room, had heard everything. I didn't know, she sobbed. I didn't know I saw him at the tea table, saw the glove, the tattoo, but I didn't know it was my father. Miss Marple understood then. The tattoo Amanda had seen wasn't Hartley's military insignia. It was something else, something Foster bore on his wrist. What was the tattoo? She asked, gently. A medical caduceus. He got it when he qualified as a doctor. It's just visible above his wrist. I saw it, but I didn't. I couldn't believe. Amanda collapsed into tears. Later, as Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on the nature of murder and motive. Foster had killed not from passion, but from fear of exposure, fear of losing everything he'd built over 20 years. In trying to protect his reputation, he'd destroyed it completely. The irony, Miss Marple thought, was that Mrs. Blackthorne's memoirs might never have been published. She'd been threatening to change her will, to redistribute her wealth, to expose various secrets, but how much of it was genuine intention versus her usual manipulative behavior? Foster had killed to prevent a threat that might never have materialized. But that was the nature of fear. It drove people to desperate acts. Acts they might never have contemplated in karma. Circumstances Saturday morning brought a peculiar atmosphere to St. Mary Meet the Satisfied. Exhaustion of a village that has endured high drama and survived to gossip about it. Inspector Craddock had called a meeting at the parish hall, where he would formally explain the investigation's conclusion to all parties involved. Miss Marple arrived early, taking her customary position at the edge of things where she could observe without being obvious. The room filled gradually. Sarah Jennings, vindicated but still shaken, accompanied by her mother and her fiancé. Peter Hartley, released from custody, looking gaunt but composed. David Blackthorne and Martin Cresswell, representing the legal aftermath of Mrs. Blackthorne's death. Amanda Foster, pale and red-eyed. Even Colonel Weatherby and Lady Pemberton had come, representing the general curiosity of the village. Inspector Craddock stood at the front, his notebook in hand, and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I wanted to explain the resolution of Mrs. Lavinia Blackthorne's murder. As many of you were affected by the investigation and deserve to understand what actually happened. He outlined the facts methodically. The poisoned teacup, the love letters, Foster's motive and opportunity. But it was when he began to explain the mechanics of the crime that Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Dr. Foster visited Blackthorne Manor 3 days before the garden party, ostensibly for a medical consultation. During this visit, he had access to the drawing room where Mrs. Blackthorne's personal teacup was kept in a glass-fronted cabinet. He had brought with him a preparation of digitalis, common heart medication that in concentrated form is deadly poisonous. While Mrs. Blackthorne was briefly out of the room, he opened the cabinet and applied the poison to the interior of the cup, specifically to the area where liquid would touch the porcelain. But wouldn't the poison be visible? Colonel Weatherby interrupted. Digitalis can be concentrated into a nearly colorless liquid. A small amount, carefully applied to the cup and allowed to dry, would be virtually undetectable. When hot tea was poured into the cup at the garden party, the poison would dissolve into the liquid. Mrs. Blackthorne would ingest it with her first sip. How can you be certain it was Foster? Lady Pemberton demanded. Multiple factors. First, his fingerprints were found on the cabinet door, which he claimed he'd never touched. Second, analysis of his medical supply records shows an unaccounted for quantity of digitalis. Third, and most damningly, his daughter Amanda witnessed him at the tea table during the garden party. She couldn't identify him at the time. She saw only a gloved hand with a portion of a tattoo visible at the wrist. But when we examined Dr. Foster's wrist, we found a caduceus tattoo in precisely that location. But I thought Amanda said she saw someone putting something in the honeypot. This from Sarah, her voice trembling. Miss Foster was mistaken or misremembered. In her initial shock, Craddock said carefully. What she actually witnessed was Dr. Forster checking the tea service to ensure his poisoned cup was in place. He was verifying that Mrs. Blackthorne would receive the correct cup. The hand motion she interpreted as adding something to the honeypot was actually him touching the cup to identify it by the distinctive rose pattern, Miss Marple thought. This was generous to Amanda. The girl had likely been protecting her father subconsciously, misdirecting attention to the honeypot to draw suspicion away from the teacup. But there was no benefit in saying so publicly. What I don't understand, David Blackthorne said, is why my aunt didn't notice the poison. Digitalis has a bitter taste, doesn't it? In crude form, yes. But Dr. Foster had pharmaceutical training. He knew how to prepare the compound to minimize taste. And the Earl Grey tea itself has a distinctive flavor that would mask slight bitterness. Mrs. Blackthorne took 2 sips before collapsing. Poison was concentrated enough to be lethal even in that small amount. Hartley spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge of bitterness. And all of this could have been avoided if certain people hadn't been so eager to assume my guilt based on circumstantial evidence. Mr. Hartley, Craddock said, I apologize for the distress caused by your arrest. The evidence against you, your resentment toward Mrs. Blackthorne, your access to the honeypot, your military tattoo appeared compelling. It was only through Miss Marple's observations that we recognized the inconsistencies and looked deeper. All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who smiled with modest embarrassment. I merely noticed small things that didn't quite fit the obvious narrative. The timing of Mrs. Blackthorne's change of heart. For instance, why would she suddenly decide to revise her will and pardon Sarah unless something significant had occurred? The answer was that she was preparing to publish her memoirs and wanted to settle her affairs first. Did she actually plan to publish memoirs? Cresswell asked. I saw no manuscript, no publishing contract. Because Dr. Foster destroyed them, Craddock said. During his final house call the day before the garden party, he searched her study, while she was occupied elsewhere, and removed all drafts of the memoir, along with correspondence she'd had with a potential publisher. We found ashes in his home fireplace that matched the paper Mrs. Blackthorne used for her personal correspondence. So he destroyed the memoirs, but killed her anyway. David sounded confused. Why? Because she told him she had multiple copies, Miss Marple said quietly. It was likely Mrs. Blackthorne enjoyed having power over people, and telling Foster there were other copies ensured he remained anxious and controllable. But Foster believed her, and therefore believed the only way to prevent publication was to ensure she never lived to authorize it. The room fell silent as people absorbed this. A murder committed over memoirs that might never have existed, to prevent revelations that might never have been made. The blackmail letters, Sarah said hesitantly. Were they connected to all this? In a way, Craddock replied. We now believe Mrs. Blackthorne wrote them herself, mailed them to her own address to create the impression. Someone was blackmailing her. We found drafts in her handwriting hidden in her study. It was another form of manipulation. She could claim she was a victim, generate sympathy, and potentially use the blackmail as an excuse to explain financial arrangements or changes to her will. That's monstrous, Lady Pemberton breathed. To fabricate such a thing. Mrs. Blackthorne was a complicated woman, Miss Marple said diplomatically. She wielded power through control and manipulation. It made her many enemies, though few with the desperation to actually murder her and her husband. David asked quietly, was my uncle's death really suicide? Craddock hesitated. The inquest 17 years ago returned a verdict of accidental death, and we have no evidence to contradict that officially. What we know is that Geoffrey Blackthorne was deeply unhappy in his marriage, that his wife was having an affair, and that his car went off a bridge during a rainstorm. Whether that was accident, suicide, or something else, we may never conclusively know. But Miss Marple, watching David's face, suspected he had his own theories. The son who'd been provided for, but never truly loved, would have understood his uncle's desperation better than most. What happens now? Sarah asked. To all of us. Dr. Foster will face trial for murder, Craddock said. The evidence is substantial. As for the rest, Mr. Hartley, you're free to go, with the apology of the police force. Miss Jennings, you're cleared of all suspicion. Mr. Blackthorne, your inheritance proceeds as per your aunt's original will, and St. Mary Mead returns to normal, or at least what passes for normal in this village. After the meeting, people dispersed slowly, processing everything they'd learned. Miss Marple found herself approached by several parties offering thanks Sarah, tearful and grateful. Hartley, stiffly, formal but genuine. Even David Blackthorne, who shook her hand with unexpected warmth. You saved me from a rather substantial scandal, he said. If Hartley had been convicted, there would always have been doubt. Questions about whether I'd somehow arranged it to protect my inheritance. Thank you for finding the truth. The truth was always there, Miss Marple replied. It merely needed patient observation to emerge. As she walked home through the village, she passed Dr. Foster's surgery, now dark and shuttered, and thought about Amanda, who would have to rebuild her life from the ruins of her father's choices. The girl had lost everything: her father, her reputation by association, her place in the village. But she was young, Miss Marple reflected. Young people were resilient in ways the elderly could only remember. 3 weeks after Dr. Foster's arrest, St. Mary Mead had achieved a semblance of normalcy. The village still talked about the murder. Of course, such things provided conversational fodder for years, but the intensity had faded to a comfortable background murmur. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a Tuesday afternoon, her knitting needles clicking with their customary rhythm. She had just finished a pair of socks for her great-nephew, and was contemplating whether to start a cardigan, when Inspector Craddock appeared at her gate. Inspector. How lovely. Do come in. I've just made lemonade. They settled in her garden, where roses bloomed with improbable perfection and bees hummed their industrious song. Craddock looked more relaxed than he had in weeks. Foster has confessed, he said without preamble, fully and completely. His solicitor advised against it, but he said he was tired of lying, tired of pretending. The trial will be a formality. How is Amanda managing? As well as can be expected. She's moved to London, couldn't bear to stay in the village with everyone knowing. David Blackthorne gave her £5,000 from his inheritance, which was unexpectedly generous. Not unexpected, Miss Marple corrected gently. David understands what it's like to be collateral damage in other people's dramas. The money was conscience payment, perhaps, or simple kindness. Either way, it will help Amanda start fresh, and Sarah Jennings has married her Peter. Quick ceremony, no fuss, but they seem happy. Love often flourishes in the aftermath of crisis. It puts things in perspective. Craddock sipped his lemonade, then set it down with a sigh. Miss Marple, I have to ask, when did you know it was Foster? I suspected from the moment. Inspector mentioned the love letters with initials JF. It was too coincidental a village doctor with those precise initials, present at the party with medical knowledge. But suspicion isn't proof. I needed to understand the mechanism of the crime before I could be certain. The teacup, yes. Once I realized the poison must have been in a specific vessel rather than the general tea service. Foster became the obvious candidate. He'd made house calls, had access to the drawing room, understood dosages and preparation. And his reaction when I suggested analyzing the cup for fingerprints confirmed it. A truly innocent man would have been curious or helpful. Foster was terrified. You took a considerable risk confronting him alone. Not alone, you and your constables were nearby. And besides, Inspector, I'm an old woman. People dismiss old women. They underestimate our capacity for understanding and our willingness to take calculated risks. She smiled over her knitting. It's a considerable advantage in investigations. Asterisk noted for future reference. Craddock stood, preparing to depart. Oh, one more thing. We found Mrs. Blackthorne's actual memoir manuscript, hidden in a safe deposit box at her bank in Milchester. Foster never knew it existed. What will happen to it? David has the legal right to it now. He's decided to have it privately printed. Just a few copies for family. He says everyone deserves to tell their story, even difficult people like his aunt. After Craddock left, Miss Marple remained in her garden, thinking about stories and secrets. Lavinia Blackthorne had wanted to tell her story, to be remembered on her own terms. Instead, she would be remembered primarily as a murder victim, cautionary tale about manipulation and its consequences. John Foster had wanted to protect his reputation, to prevent past mistakes from destroying present respectability. Instead, he'd become exactly what he'd feared being revealed as, someone whose ethics were situational, whose love had curdled into resentment, whose fear had driven him to unforgivable acts, and the innocent bystander Sarah Hartley. Amanda had been caught in the crossfire of other people's decades-old conflicts, their lives disrupted by secrets they'd never been party to. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a very human tragedy. Not the dramatic passion of romantic murder, but the banal horror of self-preservation taken to its logical extreme. The village would recover. Villages always did. Already there were new scandals emerging. Mrs. Carmichael's nephew had been spotted with Lady Pemberton's niece in what was definitely not a business meeting. The post office was rumoured to be closing and reopening as a coffee shop. Life, with its endless capacity for generating new dramas, continued. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked on. She had observed, deduced, and helped reveal truth. Now she could return to what she did best: watching, listening, and understanding the intricate patterns of human behavior that played out daily in this small English village. A murder had been solved. Justice, imperfect but real, had been achieved. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had ensured that the innocent were protected and the guilty held accountable. That was, she thought with satisfaction, a successful conclusion to a troubling case, though she had no illusions that it would be her last. Human nature being what it was, there would always be another secret, another deception, another crime that required the patient observation of an elderly lady with sharp eyes and sharper understanding. But for now, there were socks to knit, roses to tend, and the peaceful rhythms of village life to enjoy. Miss Marple settled more comfortably in her chair, her needles catching the afternoon light, and allowed herself a small smile of contentment. The garden party, where death had been served with tea, was already becoming memory, fading into the long catalogue of St. Mary Mead's history. Life, persistent and resilient, had reasserted itself, and Miss Marple, guardian of truth and observer of human folly, was exactly where she belonged, in her garden, watching the world go by, ready for whatever mystery might next present itself.